Hello everyone. Thank you for watching. In this particular episode, I will discuss about Canada's immigration policy last 30 years. And I chose that so it makes more sense because many of us have actually vivid memory how things evolved since 1996 to present. And although Canada has been known for last 60 years to have a stable immigration policy, but last 30 years, it just went in a different trajectory. And in this particular episode, we'll look at era by era. I tried to break it down into four eras. And so you will be able to track the prime minister that was in power when all this policy was implemented, including the ministers and the numbers that speaks for itself. So I hope it will give you some insight. And by no means this is a complete analysis because immigration policy has so many tentacles that each element need to be discussed within its own context. And you will notice that some of these immigration issues are tied with many things, such as one of the pressing issue right now is the affordability of housing. And I'll do a separate episode on housing in another episode. And that will basically highlight the government reactive policy and how all of this thing really affect, and the source of the issues come from one policy domain, which is basically the immigration policy. So immigration policy will affect some of the elements of the housing crisis, social issues, and resource allocation, and the capacity of the country to manage a disproportionate number of people coming in versus resources that can handle in a compressed period of time. So let's dive in and we'll look at the number and go from there. Thank you. About 30 years ago, Canada ran what many call the most successful immigration system in the world. Today, for the first time in a generation, Ottawa is cutting immigration and openly admitting its own policy pushed housing infrastructure and services past their limits. This is not a story about whether immigration is good or bad. That framing is, in my view, is not helpful. And this is a story about how four distinct policy eras, rather, under five prime ministers and more than a dozen immigration ministers reshaped this country. And what the data actually shows. We'll follow the numbers and name the decision makers and ask the only question that matters. Did the population growth overrun the country's capacity to absorb it? This is a Policy Pulse episode 12. Welcome. Thank you for watching. As you know, most immigration debates starts with the wrong question, at least in my mind. Is immigration good or bad? That framing produces heat, controversy, anger, frustration, all kind of thing, not light stuff. And it's easy to dismiss as partisan. The better question is more measurable. How did policy evolve since 1996, and what did each change due to housing, labor markets, infrastructure, and population growth? Those are the metrics. Here is the thesis upfront. So you can hold me to it. Canada's challenge was never immigration alone. The challenge was allowing population growth, especially the explosion of temporary residents after 2016, or some can argue that prior to that, to outpace housing construction, infrastructure expansion, and healthcare capacity. That's not just my opinion. You don't have to take it from me. As you will see, it's now effectively the federal government's own position, backed by its own policy reversal. I have chosen this 30 years as a timeline, but I didn't want it to go back too far back because prior to 30 years, things were quite stable. Canada's population was not really what it is now today, and there was not a significant problem. But we can deal with that earlier eras, perhaps another episode. But for now, let's keep our focus on this particular eras. Okay, so let's establish a scale first. In the late 90s, Canada admitted roughly 175 to 250,000 permanent residents a year, and the temporary population was small. Fast forward in 2024, set an all-time record of nearly 484,000 permanent residents. Before 2025, dropped back to about 394,000 under the new cuts. But permanent residents were never the whole story. In 2023, Canada added 1.27 million people in a year, over 3% growth, the fastest in 1957. And nearly two-thirds of that came from temporary residents, students, and workers. At the October 2024 peak, 3.15 million temporary residents made up 7.6% of everyone living in Canada. That's roughly the size of our Indigenous population in Canada, slightly less perhaps. Hold those three numbers, everything else in this episode flows from them. So let's dive in a little further. So this 30-year arc breaks into four eras. At least that's how I wanted to look at it. Era 1, 1996 to 2001, the old model, let's call it. The Hong Kong handover drives a migration wave. Intake runs about 175 to 250,000 permanent residents a year, which I mentioned. Almost everyone arrives as a permanent resident, and housing stays affordable. Era 2, which is 2002 to 2015, economic expansion, skilled workers became the priority. Provincial nominee programs spread across the country, and the machinery of today's system, including express entry, gets built. Era 3, 2016 to 2023, the surge, permanent targets climbs past 400,000, but the real explosion is temporary, students and temporary workers. Era 4, 2024 to now, the retrenchment era, caps, cuts, and by late 2025, the first quarterly population decline in the modern day record, as we can see. It's important to look into the accountability factor because it needs names. Jean Chrétien Liberal government ran the old model through four ministers, Marchi, Robillard, Kaplan, and Coder. I hope I'm pronouncing their name properly. Sorry. Keeping intake under 250,000. Paul Martin government continued it with Judy Segro and Joe Volpe. Then Stephen Harper, and here's the part many viewers get wrong. Harper was no low immigration conservative. Under Scholberg, Finley, Jason Kenney, and Chris Alexander, his government expanded the temporary foreign worker program, grew the provincial nominee programs, and built express entry. Harper laid framework. Justin Trudeau then scaled it through five ministers, McCallum, Hussein, Mendocino, Fraser, and Miller, taking admissions from 272,000 to a record 484,000. And since May 2025, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Minister Lena Matlaich Diab has been managing the retreat, roughly 394,000 in 2025, falling to a flat 380,000 target. So obviously it's important to know those people who actually were involved, and they were never really called to question or held them accountable for their actions. Here is a graph that may help. The permanent resident line, let's call it, 1996 to 2026. Notice three things. First, the long plateau for 20 years under liberals and conservative alike. Canada admitted between 175 to 280,000 people a year. Policy change, government change, the volume barely did. Second, climb after 2016, which is an important, I guess, point. 296,000 and then 321,000 and then 341 by 2019. And the third, the spike after the pandemic collapse of 2020. Ottawa went big, 406,000 in 2021, 438 in 2022, 472 in 2023, and 484 in 2024. You get the picture. Records every single year. Then the turn of 394,000 in 2025 and a flat 380,000 target through 2028. But remember, this chart is a smaller half of the story. The bigger half is what this line doesn't show, which is the temporary resident issue. So now let's look at this chart. This is the chart Ottawa would rather you'd never seen, or they never really volunteered, or the media never really bothered to analyze or explain. Temporary residents, international students, work permit holders, asylum claimants went from roughly 1.4 million in 2021 to 2.5 million in 2023, peaking at 3.15 million in October 2024. That's a 7.6% of the entire population. This is a huge number, and it has a significant effect on every part of Canadian economy and lifestyle. No parliamentary vote. Statistic Canada says temporary foreign worker numbers had already more than doubled between 2011 and 2021. Then the post-pandemic years poured fuel on the fire, so to speak. In 2023, temporary residents alone grew by more than 800,000, nearly double the permanent intake. The reversal is now just as dramatic. In the third quarter of 2025, the temporary population fell by 176,479, the largest quarterly drop ever recorded, enough to shrink Canada's total population for the first time. So these are important number and statistic that we should look at. And the government hardly explains. And all these ministers, they do all those kind of stuff, but then they never really come to the people and basically explains, their actions, the result of their action. There is no accountability. And media hardly ask any tough question. They just really ask a question that's already spinned. Now let's put the two curves together. This is the squeeze, so to speak. In 2022, Canada added just over a million people and started 262,000 homes. In 2023, 1.27 million people with only 240,000 housing starts. That's roughly 5 new residents for every housing starts. And the start isn't a finished home. CMHC, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, as you know, own its own analysis says Canada needs over 430,000 completions a year through 2030 to restore affordability, nearly double what the industry has ever delivered. Let's be fair about causes. Interest rates, of course, zoning, construction, capacity, and municipalities and their approvals, all of those factor matters. And there would be problems with the zero immigration. So those are important things to consider. But the demand is the demand. When population growth runs at triple the housing growth rate for 3 consecutive years, no supply side policy on earth can catch up. And I always maintain that without solving the supply side, it's a no-brainer. You're not going to change the equation of the demand side and the price side of this housing crisis. And even recently, Carney government apparently just whispering and announced that there will be $2 or $3 billion bailout in British Columbia. At least will get majority of those funding. They're bailing out the unsold inventory from the developer who are in a shaky situation, and buying about 22,000 to 2,200 apartments units. Although the detailed framework of the policy hasn't been announced, but these are all very, incoherent and illogical kind of a piecemeal decision making. In order to solve, we need to have a comprehensive and well thought out plan. So, without explaining the rationale, just spending money is going to increase inflation and other things. So that's not going to solve anything. So we'll deal with that issues probably in a further future episode. But for now, let's keep our focus on the immigration matter here. So how much of the housing crisis is actually immigration driven? There is a real answer. A joint IRCC statistic Canada study tracked municipalities from 2006 to 2021 and found new immigrant inflows were associated with about 11% of the rise in both home values and rents nationally. And the effect was only statistically significant in Ontario and British Columbia, in large urban centers. It's bigger, 21% of the home value growth and 13% of the rent growth. So both extremes are wrong. Immigration caused the housing crisis. False. Most of the increase came from rates, zoning, underbuilding. Immigration has nothing to do with the housing. Also false. A fifth of big city price growth is not nothing. Toronto went from roughly 198,000 to over $1 million. Vancouver, 288,000 to $1.2 million. Demand made a wall of constrained supply, and the policy set the demand. So, as I said from the beginning, that it's not the demand was keep growing, but the supply never really grew proportionally. So obviously, we're in a very bad spiral. Here is another way of looking at it from the immigration perspective. Who actually arrives change as much as how many. In the late 90s, Hong Kong led the handover wave. You may recall in 1996 was the beginning, and 1997 was China was handover Hong Kong from British to China. China, India, and the Philippines and Pakistan. By mid 2000, India and China traded places at the top. Today, India is the dominant source by a wide margin across every stream at once. Permanent residents, India first, then Philippines, China, Nigeria, Cameroon. Wait a minute, Nigeria, Cameroon? Most Canadians probably you would not think about it, but it's true. International students, again, India first, China second, Nigeria third. Wow, wow. The Philippines and French account for roughly 60% of the study permits. Even it shocked me. Temporary foreign workers category Mexico, India, the Philippines, Guatemala, and Jamaica about 71% of program admission on that category. So that concentration carries a risk. When one country dominates every pipeline, a diplomatic dispute, a fraud wave in one market, or a sudden policy change ripples through the entire system. Also, from a simple strategic perspective, you don't want to have one particular country over influence or dominate. Anyway, let's do a stillman argument, the case for high migration, because it's real. Canada is aging fast. Without newcomers, the workers to retiree ratio collapses and pension math stops working. The Business Council of Canada argues immigration is the only realistic answer to chronic labor shortage. And in healthcare, construction trades, and agri-food, newcomers genuinely fill gaps. And AI is not going to help much on that too, just as a side note. The Century Initiative wants Canada's planning for 100 million people by 2100 for long run economic weight, and Bank of Canada research credits newcomers with expanding labor supply and easing wage pressure when inflation was raging. And the headline numbers back them. Through 2023 and 2024, immigration was practically the only thing keeping Canada's GDP growing. The economy got bigger. The question critics ask is bigger for whom? Obviously, all the big corporations, they always benefit from additional people. Now, let's look at what the critics are saying. And then notice that they are not the fringe voices. In early 2024, National Bank economists warned Canada had walked into a population trap. Growth was so fast, the country could not build capital, that is, housing, hospitals, transit, quickly enough to maintain living standards. The parliamentary budget officer flagged the widening housing gap. And we all know this is, we already know, nobody has to actually tell us. The Auditor General reported on how poorly the student program reforms were managed. Again, these are all known. The data underneath, per capita GDP declined even as headline GDP grew. The pie grew, but each slice shrank. Wage suppression risk concentration in low wage sectors, hooked on a temporary workers, gig workers, and services strained. ER, wait times, classroom space, 6.5 million Canadians without a family doctor. One thing I won't claim, a crime link, at least in this particular episode. Canadian evidence doesn't support it, and this channel doesn't really do innuendo or getting people upset or creating the hyperbole. That's not this channel for sure. The defensible critic is capacity and not the character. Then came the reversal, which is a current era, and it's the closest thing to an admission of error you will ever get from a government. Starting in 2024, a cap on international students cutting permits about 35%, then another 10, restrictions on low-wage temporary foreign workers, and for the first time in history, a levels plan for temporary residents, targeting under 5% of the population, down from 7.6% permanent targets fell to. The old 485,000 that I mentioned plan became the 395,000 for 2025. And under Mark Carney and the Minister Lina Metlej-Diab, a flat 380,000 through 2028. With the new temporary arrivals capped, the economic share of admissions pushed to 64%, and 33,000 temporary workers already here transitioned to permanent status. The result was immediate. In the third quarter of 2025, Canada's population shrank, the first quarterly decline on record. The experiment is over. Now they are managing the unwind. And just to put a side note, Australia also indicated some declining in their, I guess, immigrant population. Many expats are returning back to some other countries. But anyway, that's just a sideline information. Now let's put it all on one scorecard so you can easily understand the pattern. And the pattern is unmistakable for sure. John Chrétien, Paul Martin, moderate permanent intake, almost no temporary population, strong affordability, low infrastructure stress. Contrast with Prime Minister Harper's higher intake and a growing temporary stream. Affordability starts eroding in Vancouver and Toronto, but the systems holds. Then came Prime Minister Trudeau's first term, which looks more like Harper's than anyone wants to admit from the conservative side. High but managed. Then 2020 to 2023, that breaks that pattern. Record permanent admissions, an uncontrolled temporary surge, severe affordability stress, infrastructure straining everywhere. The 2024 onward row is tells this story. Temporary numbers falling fast, but affordability is still severe and pressure is still high. Because population can be cut quickly, housing shortage can't. The damage outlives a policy that caused it. And nobody has been held accountable and nobody explained. I'd like to hear from those ministers who were involved in all of those files. Uh, they just shuffle around to different ministry and people forget about what they did and whether they were ever held accountable. Now let's look at our usual snapshot of follow the money and who are the winners and losers. So in this case, who actually won? Of course, property owners. If you bought in 1996, your home roughly quintuple and population-driven demand underwrote it. For employers, an ever-expanding labor pool meant muted wage pressure for 2 decades. Universities and colleges, oh, they just had a jolly good time. International tuition quietly became their main business model. Some institutions were functionally visa mills with classrooms attached. And governments themselves, immigration delivered headline GDP growth and a growing tax base without ever confronting Canada's population problem. And of course, a permanent voting pool that the characteristic favor the political parties for ensuring that those newcomers will be voting for them. So there's all kind of different angles and winners in that. So who carried the risk? Of course, renters, the first-time buyers, priced out at a record speed. Recent immigrants themselves, they were not benefiting, sold a promise and then landed in a housing market and job queue the policy had already saturated. Low-wage worker competing with an elastic temporary pool and the public service absorbing the gap. The benefits were privatized, strain was socialized. So this whole policy, it created much more divide in our society than anything else. And of course, some people only point finger to the immigration community only, but a lot of the immigrant community, they suffer because they were promised, as I mentioned, a, a promised land, but they find it that is out of their reach to afford a desirable housing. And that issue is not going to change anytime soon unless the government really look at this comprehensive problem with a solution that's actually fair and balanced, not benefiting the big corporations and the political parties themselves and the special interest group that they represent. So here is the verdict. Immigration did not break Canada. Unplanned growth did. Mismanagement did. For 60 years, the model worked because the volumes roughly matched the country's capacity to absorb them in terms of having the resources and the people and the services. Jean Chrétien's 220,000 and Mr. Harper's 260,000 arrival of immigrants into a country that could house them. At least it was manageable. Between 2016 and 2023, especially after 2020, that discipline collapsed. Ottawa let the population growth run at triple the pace of the home building, mostly through temporary channels nobody voted on, and then spent the next 2 years cutting, capping, and reversing its own policy. When a government dismantles its own program, that's not partisan spin, that is the verdict and the result. The real question now, can Canada remain an immigration country, which it should or should not? It's up to the people to decide, while tying every admission targets to homes built, doctors hired, and transit laid. Let me know what you think and any comments that you may have. And I'll see you on the next episode. Thank you.